no, I know. It's like, it's not you. It's, there we are. Okay, welcome back to Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. It is lovely to have whoever's watching join us as we address Vermont basic needs, budgets, and livable wage. Lovely to hear that term livable wage embedded in this. And to kick us off, we're going to have Representative Elizabeth Burrows come and present. She was the reporter of the floor of H157. So Elizabeth, come and join us. And then we're going to chat with Ellen and Dan about what the implications of H157 are. So welcome. Is this your first time in our committee?
Yes.
Well, then maybe we should introduce ourselves. Mistress Elizabeth. Okay, I am Allison Clarkson. As you well know, we are partners in crime in Windsor County. Randy?
And I'm Randy Brock from Franklin and Grand Isle.
Hello. Wendy Harrison from Wyndham.
Hi. Ann Cummings, right here, Washington County. Hi. And Stowe and Braintree and Orange.
And I'm Elizabeth Burrows, and I'm Representative Elizabeth Burrows. I represent Windsor 1, which is Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor.
And I love the fact that you're Windsor 1, because what happened in Windsor? Yes, our kindness, Donna Swaney would remind us on a regular basis. Vermont was formed in Windsor, so that's why we're Windsor 1.
Yep.
Yeah, which is great. So Elizabeth, would you be kind enough to give us sort of an overview of what the objective is with H157 and what your committee did with
it? Well, by statute, the Joint Fiscal Office conducts a biannual basic needs budget study, and that's using using data gathered from federal and state sources, so that we can know where we are before we start, so we can know how we're doing serving Vermonters before we start jiggering things at the start of each biennium. And since the report's enactment, the JFO has been mandated to use a particular methodology. For calculating basic needs from a November 9th, 1999 Livable Income Study Committee report. The last time the methodology underwent a revision or a technical evaluation was in 2008.
Oh, that was the last revision?
Yes. The January 15th, 2021 Vermont Basic Needs Budget and Livable Wage Report included the following request, and this is verbatim from the underlined penultimate paragraph. From the underlined penultimate paragraph of the executive summary on page 1, said the Joint Fiscal Office strongly recommends that the General Assembly consider the appointment of another advisory committee to comprehensively review and possibly recommend updates to the statute methodology and available data prior to the release of the 2023 report. And that didn't happen.
Oh, okay.
With this bill, H157, it can, the strike all amendment set up the technical advisory committee requested by the JFO to examine the way basic needs budget and livable wage are calculated. Our committee outlined the makeup of what that committee would be comprised of. So 2 members from the House, not from the same political party, 2 members from the Senate, also not from the same party, Secretary of Human Services or designee, an appointment from the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, an appointee from the Society for Human Resource Management of the Vermont State Council, and 1 appointee from Capstone Community Action. And with technical assistance from JFO, the Department of Labor's Economic and Labor Market Information Division, and Legislative Council. they will take testimony from subject matter experts who can assist with data analysis and methodological considerations, and from a variety of stakeholders, including employers, employees, and organizations that represent employers and employees. According to our amendment, it would start on or before August 1st and cease to exist as a committee, an advisory committee, January 30th, 2025. And in the meantime, they will report back on or before November 1st, 2023. So short deadline. The good news is that the next time the JFO prepares its basic needs budget and livable wage report, it will be using the findings from that committee.
Got it. And we have, so it's it's got 2 phases.
Yeah.
Work for 24 and work for 25.
Yeah.
And we apply that, this is applied in many aspects of our work in the State House, the basic needs livable wage. I'm not sure why there's a different name for it, but they can discuss that in their committee when they get to it. And can you just give some of perhaps our new member and all of us actually an update on where basic needs budget is applied and considered in many of our.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, maybe you're not, maybe JFO or Ellen are better to ask.
Well, it's applied everywhere, right? It's
applied.
Basic needs budget is includes, I think there's 6 different areas,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's 7 different households.
7 different.
And then it looks at a basket of goods, and Dan is best to talk about that because he can really talk about the different costs for households.
That wasn't actually what I was asking. What I'm asking is, how do we use this in the State House?
Right. Well,
We use this in lots of different committees and different bills every time we consider minimum wage or what it needs, when we're considering benefits. The Human Services Committee uses it a lot. I mean, this is actually a fairly important thing for us to get right, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
yeah, because we also use it. We use it in housing.
We use it.
It applies everywhere. The reason that I was asking or talking about the elements of it was because the elements, even just those elements of it, which are how much housing costs, healthcare, basic products to live a regular life, childcare, even in just those different things. Those are direct applications, but there are secondary and tertiary applications that
So I guess all I'm trying to remind our committee is that we got to get this right because it's applied in lots of different capacities within the State House. That's my only point.
And just one little question. I think I just want to confirm what I heard. I think you said JFO strongly recommended this in
they put
the
it
updated 2021.
Yeah, they put it as on the second to last paragraph of the executive summary. They put it in bold writing.
I mean, that's
We need
pretty,
this.
that's a big deal.
And
JFO
so
doesn't often take
Jeff-
opinions.
Yeah. So
Dan's gonna test.
No, but that really got my attention.
the 1-sentence summary is that JFO strongly asked for this and we didn't do it. We need to do it.
Okay.
That you could have done that. That could have been like your report on the floor.
It could
JFO asked for this. We didn't do it. We're doing it now.
And they don't ask for things generally,
right.
is my understanding so far. Okay.
So
So that means it's really.
That means it's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
yeah.
Great. And thank you, Elizabeth. And I think we're going to shift.
Thank you.
What makes most sense to shift to first to Ellen and we've walked through this bill with Damien so that we've walked through, so we don't need to walk through this with Damien. It's great to have him here. Thank you, Mistress Burrows.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, come any day to see our artwork and enjoy our company. I think we're gonna shift, let's shift to Ellen.
She has the history background, she's been involved in.
Ellen and the Sustainable Jobs Fund, Wendy. This is Ellen
Okay.
of the Sustainable Jobs
We
Fund.
met.
And so Ellen, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much. For the record, Ellen Kaler, Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. So yes, we have been also wanting this bill to happen for a number of years because it is time for a technical review of the methodology. You should have at your placement there, and it's also on your website, a very brief PowerPoint, which probably makes it easier for you guys just to look at it. I thought, yes, that's it. I think it would just be, especially some of you are new to this document that is produced by Joint Fiscal every 2 years. Where it originally came from, it actually originated all the way back in 1996 with the release of the Basic Needs Budget and Livable Wage that the Peace and Justice Center put out. That was the original one. It was when I was the executive director of the Peace and Justice Center. And at the time, I had contracted with then policy analyst Doug Hoffer, now known as the auditor, to basically develop the methodology. It was based on a methodology originated in Minnesota that I became aware of and thought this is a very useful methodology because at the time in the mid-90s, you may recall, was when a lot of welfare reform was happening and more people who were receiving public assistance were being asked to take on work requirements. And so what we wanted to do was to develop a methodology and an understanding of what does it cost to live in Vermont. And therefore, if you're working full-time and paying your bills, how much money do you need to earn so that you don't qualify for public assistance? That was the basis of it, was that you could be economically self-sufficient if you earned a livable wage. Now, at the time, the minimum wage was something like, I don't know, $5.75 or something like that an hour. And so what we wanted to do was to make sure that from a methodological standpoint, that the data that was used was conservative, because we knew that the sticker shock was going to be quite a lot, given what the minimum wage at the time was. So the methodology was something that we replicated a couple of times over, and then brought it to Senate Economic Development. Actually, when Susan Bartlett was the senator and chair of your committee, and said we were advocating for minimum wage increases at that point, using the livable wage as sort of like, but this is what it costs to live, and the minimum wage is so low that can you do some bumps to the minimum wage? And there were like 2 years in a row where there were like 50-cent bumps to the minimum wage. The important thing to recognize is it is not the livable wage methodology where we construct these budgets. And if you take a look on your handout there, on the third page, where it actually shows the original copy of the Vermont Job Gap Study, right? This is like 1996, right? And then on the next page, what ended up happening was there was a summer study commissioned in 1999. Tom Cavett won the contract from JFO, and there were 3 other researchers, Deb Brighton, who many of you know, Doug Hoffer, of course, and Elaine McCrate, who's was an economics professor at UVM. And they worked together over the course of about 6 months with a legislative committee. It was a committee made up of all legislators at the time, to review what the Peace and Justice Center had done and to make suggestions and revisions to the Basic Needs Budget methodology. And then in essence, what that did was that report then came back to the legislature that January of 2020, I'm sorry, January 2000, 22 years ago. And in essence, it became then something that the legislature in essence adopted and then tasked Joint Fiscal Office with updating it. Back then it was every year. And then that shifted when did that shift, Dan? It was like, I have it in the slides here. Sometime in 2008 one was just then started doing every other year, which is how it's been done since 2008. In that process, this notion of a technical advisory committee to meet periodically with Joint Fiscal Office to review the methodology and update it this notion was put into statute, as was mentioned. So since 2008, that nothing has changed with the methodology other than these very minor little tweaks that joint fiscal is completely authorized to do. Any kind of substantive change to the methodology, like a major change, for instance, in a data source or an approach to calculating a particular line item of the budget, is supposed to go to a technical advisory committee, and then the joint fiscal committee can approve that change without it having to come back to the full legislature. So that's what's in statute.
You never set up the technical advisory committee?
Well, it's something that the legislature needs to actually do with the joint fiscal office. So the purpose of this bill is to set that in motion. So the notion here is that this technical advisory committee, which is not a policy-oriented group of people, right? This has got to be a group of people that have acumen looking at data, who can take a look at and walk through the budget line items in these basic needs budgets and understand the pros and cons of different data sets, the assumptions behind the data, and be able to put forward a recommendation to joint fiscal office and ultimately to joint fiscal committee about what our best thinking is for how that methodology needs to be updated and changed, so that joint fiscal office, when it produces its next report coming out in January of 2025, uses that updated methodology. It brings everything up to date with the data that is available. And you just think about all the things that have changed out there in the landscape, from healthcare, how we pay for healthcare, if the childcare supports go through this year, paid family leave, all of those kinds of new other kinds of policy changes that you all have made, we want to make sure is reflected and captured in this. The intention is that the committee will meet, I don't know, something like 5 times or something like that between August and November, and we'll hear from subject matter experts. So the idea is have all of the people that are really understand data around the housing and the demographics of who's in what type of housing and how much is housing cost. Same thing with childcare, same thing with transportation people. Have those subject matter experts, both private sector, nonprofits, government folks, come in and speak to what they think is the best data sources and what are some of the issues and challenges, things that should be considered. Then the committee then would sift through all of that and come up with a recommendation for any changes to the methodology and give that to the joint fiscal committee. Now, the thing that could also change is, for instance, what's on the table is it might be that it doesn't make sense to have 7 different family sizes anymore. So that would be something that could be considered. There might be some other line item of the budget that really makes sense to add now that hadn't been considered before because it just wasn't as relevant. Again, the point here is to do as good a job as possible reflecting what does it actually cost to live in Vermont in a bare bones kind of basic needs way, so that if you're working full time, you should be able to pay your bills without public assistance. And we can't mandate that wage, especially like, for instance, a 4-person household with 2 kids, ages 4 and 6, which is what one of the family sizes is. You can't mandate that, but it does provide very helpful guidance to businesses who are wanting to say that they're a livable wage employer. It also is important for, as you said, Senator Clarkson, to the Agency of Human Service. They peg a lot of their programs to the livable wage number. The Vermont training program at Department of Economic Development, for instance, in that statute, it talks about that at least a livable wage has to be paid for workers who are being supported through the training program. So it is something that is definitely embedded and endemic at this point. But it needs to be updated with the most relevant data sources out there.
Right.
And we were very selective of, who else should be on here. The reason why, for instance, the SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Managers, because that is an association that represents HR professionals. So they are going to bring to the table an awareness of a lot of the data from the private sector of what the issues are that employers are challenged with on an HR perspective. And then Capstone, because they're, local to Montpelier, represent, one of the second largest CAP agencies. they are representing so many of the low-income folks that are getting public services and trying to get out of poverty and earn livable wages. So we thought that that was another group that was really important. There were earlier versions that had various housing people and all that, and it felt like what was really important was to have more of a smaller, focused group who could really focus on the data and asking the questions, and then having the housing community, have the childcare community, have the transportation community come in and give expert testimony to inform the decisions of the committee.
So I have a question, which is why, if this is supposed to be people who are so knowledgeable, do we have 4 legislators? I mean, I would think 2 legislators would be ample, given that we don't necessarily bring expertise to this table. It certainly would bring skin in the game in terms of how this is welcomed and incorporated in our work. But it strikes me that having 4 members of the legislature who are not any of the things you've just discussed, with rare exceptions included. So
Is it one from each party?
Yes. And that's the point, is it provide balance that may not necessarily exist otherwise.
or then
I
do we
think,
need any?
no, I think it's
I mean, why
important.
do we need
I do think it's important, Senator, because, and I do think Senator Brock is right. It's got to be a balance. I think bringing both chambers in is very important from a balance that way as well. And I also think that because there are so many new legislators that were not around in 2000 when this first came out, right? Part of the challenge that we are facing here is that we need to constantly re-educate the next incoming classes of legislators that this is a foundational document, that is a foundational methodology, and that why it matters. And when we tried to do something last year, one of the things that then Chair Mary Hooper said was she really felt like this was this report that comes out every 2 years should be used by the policy committees to inform their work. And it hasn't been as much because there hasn't been the level of advocacy from people like me and others to actually put it in front of you and say, hey, this is a really relevant piece of information to be using to consider in your policy discussions. And so having this updated, I think, and having 4 members on the committee will help to elevate things again, that this is important.
Okay.
It also has the ability to give the result more credibility.
Right.
Because when some folks in the legislature see a document and a program that is put together by the Peace and Justice Center as amended, it immediately raises suspicions. And having a broader committee that represents a broader scope of the attitudes of the legislature is important to give this credibility when the final product is produced.
Right. Damien, you had some.
I also just wanted to note that
Thank you for that.
this is staffed by legislative staff primarily, and at least for legislative council, we have a client relationship with members. We don't have that.
That's right.
Outside
That's
folks.
right.
So for us to staff that, we need members on there. I can't speak for JFO, but I know for my office, we need members present.
Interesting.
Dan.
And I would, Dan, you're situating this, but I'd also say that, you know, there's statutory direction for this report, and to the extent that this technical advisory committee may recommend changes to that statute, I think it would be really helpful to have legislators involved in shaping what those recommendations
Okay,
are.
got it.
And just to
Anything-
clarify too, the Peace and Justice Center at this point is not involved. Once the Peace and Justice Center got this kicked off, but then it really did hand it over to the legislature, and you all really have owned this with joint fiscal since then. And you know, I think the reason that I have been offered to serve in this way on this committee is simply for historical knowledge of this, and it's been something that, as you know, Senator Clarkson, Doug Hoffer and I kicked off. And so just to provide that history and an understanding of why certain choices were made is just going to be helpful, I think. And I'm willing to put the time in to be on that committee in that way.
You bring a huge amount of expertise and institutional memory. You're a great combo package there, Kaylor. Wendy, you have a question?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked the question about legislators, because it's helpful to know about the relationships. One question I have is JFO really wants this to happen.
Yeah.
And will they be strong enough to, I mean, can you have more than your usual relationship of sitting by and watching what's going on and then giving advice as requested? Can you somehow be more at the table? Or is there another agency or group that would be able to have JFOs, I mean, they wouldn't have all your experience, or maybe a retired, someone who used to work for JFO, who could be, more in a policy making role than a staff role. Do you understand the question?
I would say that.
Dan, why don't you come join us? Ellen's up there.
Yeah.
David's here. We're all
Speaking
fine.
of.
So I would say that, I mean, to the extent that, let's say you ask for a piece of information, I think JFO would be there to say, yes, we can do that easily, or yes, we can do that with this complication of, we'd have to buy the data, or, it's going to take an extremely long time to get the data, or we would, be there to say, we don't believe that this is possible. And I guess to give some context, in an original iteration of this bill, there was going to be some work required on benefits cliffs, and that analysis has been done in the past, but and it was done as part of the minimum wage study that was dates back to 2018. But it took a great deal of staff time, a great deal of consultant time, so it came at tremendous financial cost. And I raised that as an issue with your House counterparts that yes, this is possible, but there's going to be potentially a very high, or at least a significant cost in the scope of the JFO budget to get this information to you, and probably a time component. I don't know that we could reasonably have this by this fall. And so that, eventually dropped out of the bill. That's not to say that it couldn't be a part of this technical advisory committee's discussion. But I think, I guess to give that as context and that as background, that's, I think, what JFO is there for, to say, this is what we could realistically do. This is where we could do it, but we may need more resources, or maybe to generate, find a way to generate this data, whether it's having an agency, do outreach and collect the information, or some other means.
Okay, so that's your regular role. So what I guess I'm getting, JFO had issues with the way this is calculated now. And presumably there were reasons for those concerns, and hopefully somebody wrote it down. But could JFO perhaps propose something that the committee could look at, so that the committee was headed at least to solve the problems that JFO has internally recognized?
I think to a limited extent, yes. So there, when I teed this up in the most recent report, so I emphasized that JFO strongly urges this advisory committee. There was an appendix to the report where I listed some items that we feel merit consideration.
Okay.
There are certain areas where I don't think we should be the ones, that would make a recommendation. So, around the philosophy of the study, I think that's really up to the advisory committee. Now, to the extent that we are asked to provide information that would help make that decision, yeah, we're there for that. But I think the advisory committee is the one that needs to make a decision on the philosophy around why we do this.
That's what I'm hearing, which is why JFO's asked for this, because they don't want to be in that position any longer. They don't want to be the policy and philosophy position. They want to be the people who implement the data understanding and analysis. They don't necessarily want to be setting the direction. They want to do the work, but not have the policy direction. And that's what this committee would be more. Is that a fair way of describing that?
Yeah, and also, I mean, on top of the philosophy, there's also sort of the tactical, you know, I mean, the groundwork of doing this. And I think in that regard, you know, I think we would probably make some, or at least highlight some issues. You know, one big issue that I've dealt with that is also driving this is, you know, a component of calculating these costs is using transportation data. And the transportation data that we have available to us now is just, it's not ideal. I would like to explore possibly transitioning to something else, but doing that, I think potentially creates this sort of lump in those calculations, you know, could drive it up, down. And I didn't want to do that by itself and then have a technical advisory committee come in and a subsequent year and then make another big sort of lumpy change. I felt like if we're going to do this, let's do it all at once. And that way, you know, it smooths out going forward with this new sort of, you know, methodology. If we change the methodology, which, you know, I think for transportation, we really have to. Beyond that, you know, I would leave it to the committee, but I'm happy to provide information to help guide.
Randy, and then we're going to let Dan present because we have a presentation.
Well, maybe it'll be the presentation. The issue I had is I didn't really notice an economist being specifically involved or named. I saw pretty experts. The question is, as far as economists, is the intent here to rely on Joyce or facilities in JFO, or is there some outside economist? I know Tom Cadet was involved in the original story. And one of the questions is, you know, there's no money in this, you know, aside from per diem. So, you know, hiring an economist doesn't seem to be envisioned, but I would think that would be a pretty basic thing to be looking for.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. You know, I think that well, at least I would want Joyce to be involved in some way. Although I think she probably wants to take a break this summer because she's been pretty swamped. So I don't want to speak for her and commit her, but I would hope for her involvement or potentially Tom Cadet's involvement. There is some money. There are two appropriations in this bill. I think we're getting $10,000 to cover the cost of retaining experts. You know, I think if we brought in Tom Cadet to do some work, he's probably going to cost more than that. But I think, you know, we have money, we have room within our budget to cover.
There's room, and I think this is just getting it started. And if it needs more money, we can address it next year. And you'll come to us and say, "Oh, we need more money. We need."
Yeah, I think, you know, going back to the benefit cliff thing, I mean, the committee may ultimately decide to do some additional work in that regard. And I think there was certainly a cost component to that. And so we, you know, next year or the year after, maybe where we come back and say, hey, the advisory committee may come in to you and recommend
so maybe
spending some money on benefits cliffs analysis or something else that we just can't do in-house with.
Right, I think we can hire that.
As I said, it just looks like a void to me.
I think Tom Cadet will definitely be involved in some way. I think, you know, between the appropriation in this bill and capacity that we have within our budget to cover costs for his services, I think we can cover it or manage it.
I thought you were very cleverly suggesting that Tom be included on the committee so he couldn't charge for his time.
Oh, I don't think.
I don't think he would volunteer for that.
Tom, just joking. I'm not just joking. It's a great idea. Okay, let's have Dan, because we only have 10 minutes left. So let's have Dan present his work.
Okay, I'll run through this really fast. So I provided this slideshow to House General back in February, and I'm going to jump just to.
Because we've kind of covered the.
Yeah, page 4 just gives some definitions, and so does page 5 just gives sort of the scope of like what the costs are that we try to capture within this study. So I won't go into tremendous detail.
So, but when they talk about all the things that we're looking at in the basic needs budget on page, whatever it is, page 5.
Yeah,
those are the 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 things.
Yeah, and then two of them aren't actually required in statute, but they were, I don't recall the history of when like clothing and household telecommunications were brought in, but I think, one big item for consideration by this technical advisory committee is, what of these costs should remain? What of these costs maybe can fall out? What maybe should be brought in, or what can be merged into, a catch-all category? I'll use, so MIT actually provides a publicly accessible calculator for every state, but they have a more limited scope of various costs, but there is one category where multiple things are sort of within that. And so that's, could be an option, which, may not give the granularity that folks are used to in seeing the study, but I think from my perspective, it may make my life simpler that's probably not that's a selfish consideration for me, but one thing to think about, but the advisory committee can go the direction it wants.
Right, but that's one of the things for them to consider. Okay.
So I'm going to jump to page 8. So this is where I'm showing on a dollar per dollar basis where sorry, just to step back, when I calculate these wages, I do calculations for urban family configurations and then rural family configurations. So this page 8 is dealing with the urban family configurations only. But these are the different wages for the families and the growth in those wages.
What does urban mean in this context? St. Albans, for example.
Hardly. I think we're all
actually St. Albans is a part of that because I use the Burlington, South Burlington, I think it's the metropolitan statistical area, which actually covers Franklin and Grand Isle. So those three counties are
Berkshire and South Burlington.
Yeah. So it's definitely not perfect, but it's because we're using federal data, that tends to be the way a lot of the data is aligned, especially for housing costs. It's the Burlington metropolitan area and then the other counties in the state.
I thought none of Vermont fell under anything other than a rural definition.
Burlington is an urban, it's a metropolitan.
National. I thought it was always still urban.
It's the area, not the city.
Okay.
But the question is how far that extends.
Yeah.
And if you say it extends to, to Berkshire and Richford, I got a problem with that.
Yeah, it's definitely not perfect. And it's something, it is consistent with the way we've done it going back, but it's certainly something that this advisory committee.
You look at it makes no sense.
Right.
It makes no sense.
But this is the kind of thing the technical assistance committee would look at.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the
growth in urban family configuration basic needs wages from the last report 2022, or the last report in 2022, the current report, which covers 2022. So the growth is significant, but given inflation, it's not a complete shock. But if you turn the page to the rural families, it's much more, the growth is much more significant. And then I've got some charts that sort of show what are the drivers to those increases. And then page 10 is just this is the Vermont livable wage. And so the Vermont livable wage is calculated from, there's a family configuration of two adults that are, we assume to be.
Sorry, are you on page 10 now?
Yeah, page 10. So it's the 2 adult family, no children, that are living together as a couple or a pair. And we take the average of the urban and rural wage to calculate the Vermont livable wage. And so that grew 14.5% between 2020 and 2022.
So it's just a plain average.
Of the urban and rural between the 2 adult families.
I see some anomalies on this that really raise. But if you take a look at the urban is higher in virtually every category in 2022, as you would expect, than rural, except when you come down to 2 adults, no children. It's higher, it's more expensive to live in a rural area than it is to live in an urban area. And you sort of say to yourself, how on earth?
Yeah,
Because
it's
gas,
it's an anomaly.
it's transportation.
It's an anomaly that's driven by the data that we have available to
Yeah,
us.
but it's heavy
Um,
transportation. is the reason for
Heavy
that.
transportation.
Yeah.
And so what happened with transportation, I'll try to explain this as high level because it gets into the weeds really
Yeah.
quickly, but we have a few different sources of data that we sort of triangulate into a transportation cost calculation. One of those sources is AAA puts out a report of like the cost to drive, and they
Right.
break those costs down by mile. And they changed their methodology in such a way that it skewed the cost heavily for mainly rural families, because traditionally it's been, as you drive more, your cost per mile goes down. But based on their methodology change, that is no longer the case. And just to be consistent, I continue using that, although it's an issue. And that caused these rural families, if you go to page 14, where I've got these bar charts showing the mix of what grew from 2020 to 2022, you see the blue, those are those transportation costs just growing dramatically. Some of that would be expected because the cost to own a car has gone up dramatically. The cost to buy gasoline has gone up dramatically. But there's another element to that is just driven solely by, a data source that we've used historically, changing their methodology for, their product they put out that we use, which, I don't feel great about. And that's, something that I would hope this advisory committee
Yeah,
would explore is,
exactly.
do we stick with this, or do we go another direction with, finding transportation data in a different place?
Or finding, would be just good to
Yeah.
review where we get the data on all.
And food is interesting.
And then the other interesting thing is, as these other costs go up, it drives the cost of taxes up, because these families would make more money to cover the cost of living. So it's just which that's the way this model is built. But it sort of exacerbates a very dramatic increase.
And it illustrates the need for this committee.
Yes.
So thank you all. We will take this up again, and I hope, are there any questions before we disperse? Sorry, Ed.
And I need to pop off to another meeting. So thank you so very much for taking testimony, and let me know if you have any more questions.
Yeah, I think we will probably, depending on the conversation here, to discuss further and maybe consider voting on this early next week.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ellen. Thanks for your work. Oh my God, she's worked on this since '96. The Peace and Justice Center is what brought Randy. That's what brought
I know,
Ellen to the
I
work.
understand that.
So
I saw the history.
we're very glad.
But you need a balance.
Oh, yeah.
That used to be how you set up committees in the legislature.
Well, the composition is not balanced.
I didn't.
So thank you. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for your involvement with this. And I thought you were getting it, like how to get Tom Cadet on a committee so he couldn't charge for his expertise.
Not good.
I thought, oh, really? That's such a clever way to get him involved.
Yes, with a gun.
Yeah.
But the only way that will happen.
Okay, so more to
Okay,
follow
I'm gonna
on
go
this,
see if
but
I
I
can
think,
find my students.
Dan, thank you.
Good luck.
This is great. And Damien, anything further? Did they have witnesses? This is on 157. I don't think so. I think we're ready to probably vote on this baby.
Yeah, was anybody opposed to it?
No.
No one was opposed to it. The Lake Champlain Chamber suggested that they be on the technical advisory committee, and the committee in the House decided that it made more sense for groups like the chambers to come in
Yeah,
as
testify.
witnesses
Yeah.
to testify. Because if they felt that if they added the Lake Champlain Chamber, then they'd start having to add like BBSR, and the committee was gonna grow.
The cap
And you were going to-
appropriate to add.
So, yeah,
But
they
they
felt, go
They
ahead.
represent the community action agencies, I think.
That was the thinking,
Yeah.
is that they were a representative of the community action agencies rather than representing like a business interest or an employee side interest or something like that. So, that's their thinking. Can't
That's
say.
their thinking.
Great, thank you. We're gonna